morning. Am I on here? All right. We're going to continue this morning in 2 Peter, and 2 Peter chapter 2 really has a lot to do with false teachers. Really, the whole thing is about false teachers, and so if you'll remember, Mike covered a little bit about it when we started chapter 2, and then I covered a little bit about it, and now we're talking about false teachers again, and you'd think, are we done yet? And the answer is no, because Dave Knoschak is actually going to share the final piece of chapter 2, which also has to do with false teachers. And what I want to do this morning is I'm going to read the passage, which is 2 Peter chapter 2, and I'm going to read from verse 1 to 16, although the verses we're covering this morning are the second half of verse 10 through verse 16. And then what I want to do after that is I want to read a little bit of Jude, just so you see how similar Peter and Jude were writing about false teachers. And the fact that they were both writing in a similar way means that it's pretty important. That they both thought it was valuable to spend a little bit of pen and ink and paper to talk about false teachers. So let's go ahead and read 2 Peter chapter 2, starting verse 1. Simeon Peter, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ. Excuse me, I went to chapter 1. Don't want to go that far. Chapter 2. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day by day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. Bold and willful, they do not tremble as they blaspheme the glorious ones, whereas angels, though greater in might and power, do not pronounce a blasphemous judgment against them before the Lord. But these, like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant, will also be destroyed in their destruction. Suffering wrong is the wage for their wrongdoing. They count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. They are blots and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions, while they feast with you. They have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained in greed, accursed children. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing, but was rebuked for his own transgression. A speechless donkey spoke with human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. So that's what we're going to cover today. Real quick, we might have it on the screen, but just a few pages away, you can go to Jude. And I just want to read verses 8 through 11. Jude wrote this: Yet in like manner, these people also, relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious ones. Very similar language already. But when the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing about the body of Moses, he did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." So already we see Peter and Jude had the same things in mind when they were thinking of these false teachers. But these people blaspheme all that they do not understand, and they are destroyed by all that they, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively. Now you start to wonder, okay, were they, having conversations about this? Were they writing letters to each other? Like, what's going on here? Very similar language. Woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error and perished in Korah's rebellion. So, false teachers are something that we need to talk about, and we've talked about them quite a bit. We talked about them a lot when we read through Jude, and again, like I said at the beginning, we're talking about them now, and that's because they are a problem. And I just want to make sure that you all understand that when I say false teachers, I don't necessarily mean someone who stands up in front of the church like I'm doing right now and says a bunch of bad doctrine. It can be that. A lot of times it is that, where you have someone who is a quote-unquote pastor who is sharing a different gospel than what was first delivered to the apostles. And they would be a false teacher. But as Mike pointed out weeks ago when he talked about that first part of chapter 2, it's not just what they teach, it's how they live. That's why Paul reminds leaders and pastors to keep watch over your life and doctrine. It's one thing to keep watch over your doctrine, which we all need to do. We need to know what we believe, and we need to know the truth. But if all you do is know the truth and know what you believe, and you have it in your head, but it's not affecting your life, then that will do harm to you and could do harm to others. So that's one piece, is it could be someone in my position, or it could be a small group leader, or it could be someone else in leadership. But it's not so specific as that. When Peter talks about false teachers, he's talking about any person, regardless of position, in the church who is spreading lies, who is destroying the gospel from within, who's destroying other Christians from within. So I just want to make that very clear. We're not just, when you picture false teachers, let your scope be a little wider than someone who's standing at a pulpit, okay? Because that'll help you to understand a little bit of what Peter is saying here. So the first thing, he's going to give us a few things, first three things about them. One, that they're arrogant. Two, that false teachers are animalistic. We'll just use that term for it. And three, that they're hedonistic. I'll explain that as we go through. But first, they're arrogant. He says in verse 10, it says, "Bold and willful, they do not tremble as they blaspheme the glorious ones. Whereas angels, though greater in might and power, do not pronounce a blasphemous judgment against them before the Lord." So first thing, really straight to the point, he says that they are bold and willful. So they're bold in the sense that they're willing to say what they need to say, they're willing to do what they need to do, but it's all for selfish gain. So yeah, I can be bold if it gets me what I want, no problem. Now there's a good boldness too that we should all have, the boldness that we have in Christ, but this is the opposite of that. This is a boldness in self. They're willful. It's all about their self-will. What can I accomplish? What can I do? What can I promote and accomplish for my own gain? And he gives an example of what that looks like with this example of the angels, which again is confusing. He says, they do not tremble as they blaspheme the glorious ones. Now, similar to what Jude said, the glorious ones probably actually refers to fallen angels, the ones that we had talked about before. And you ask, well, why would Peter use this language? Why would he call fallen angels glorious ones? It seems like that would be wrong. They're fallen. There's nothing glorious about them, right? But there's this understanding that Peter had that they're still these angelic beings. They're just fallen. They're wicked and they're fallen, but he would still consider them glorious ones because they're ones that God created. You know, you could say, okay, well, that doesn't seem to make any sense. If they're bad, they should be treated as bad. We shouldn't give them any respect or any sort of language like this. That doesn't make any sense. And I just want you to think for a moment about King David. Now, King David had many times where, a lot of times where he was being chased by Saul. And Saul was trying to kill David. King Saul was trying to kill David over and over and over again. This was just David's lot. He's being chased down constantly. And we know of at least 2 times where David had the opportunity to kill Saul. He sneaks up on him. It's the middle of the night. Oh, I could do it right now, but he doesn't. Our army is wondering, why didn't you kill him? And he says, I will not lay a hand against the Lord's anointed. And David held that view of Saul. To the point of when Saul was killed, he actually looked pretty poorly on the person that did it. But Saul was this wicked king. He was doing these terrible things, and yet David was still able to call him the Lord's anointed and treat him as the Lord's anointed. I'm not going to do any harm to this person because God has spoken this way about them. God has labeled them as such. It's a very similar thing. Now, we respond against that even now. As I say that, I feel uncomfortable about that. It's like, oh, come on, they're just bad. They're just bad. Can we just call them bad, treat them bad? Let's just get it over with, kick the dust off our feet, shun them, get them out of the way. Like, that's how it feels, but that's not how God would have us respond. And he says that the angels themselves, look at this. He says, whereas angels, verse 11, though greater in might and power, do not pronounce a blasphemous judgment against them before the Lord. So we've got these people, these false teachers in the church, and they're blaspheming, they're saying ungodly things against even the fallen angels. But you see here that even angels who are mighty and powerful, more powerful than these false teachers are, they would not pronounce a blasphemous judgment against them because the Lord would not have them do that. It's kind of a confusing passage, but either way, they're bold and willful, they're doing what they want, and they think that they're above what God says. They're above what God has decreed about what he's created. They're above what God has decreed as far as labels and all those things go. They just think of themselves in a very arrogant and prideful manner, which is also something you can pay attention to when you're looking for false teachers. The second thing that he talks about is that they're animalistic in verses 12 through 13. He says, but these false teachers, like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters which they are ignorant, will also be destroyed in their destruction, suffering wrong as the wage for their wrongdoing. So he's comparing them to animals. And the first thing he says is they're irrational. Animals are irrational. Animals cannot reason. That's basically what that word means. They're unable to sit down with you and say, you know what, you're right. I shouldn't have chewed up the couch. I'm sorry. Let's have a little logical conversation here about whether or not I should do that again. The dogs don't do that. Cats definitely don't do that. Right? There's no that, we can have conversations with them, and we've watched enough Disney movies to believe that they're somehow understanding us, and that they probably have their own, emotions and feelings that are very human, which that's not true. They do have emotions and feelings, but they're animalistic. I know I just crushed a lot of dreams. That's what I do, okay? But they're unable to reason. Animals can't do that. They cannot reason with you about things, and neither will these false teachers. You sit down and try to have a conversation with them, and they can't. They will not listen to you. Why? Why? Because they're creatures of instinct, is what he says. They're creatures of instinct. At an animal's base instinct is the idea of self-preservation. Right? I need to stay alive. So an animal, it's relatively easy to catch a rabbit, for instance. You lay a snare, you put bait that the rabbit likes, and you wait. And you, honestly, you don't think, oh, look how smart I was that I caught this rabbit. It's just the rabbit needed to eat. Instinct got the better of it, and it said, oh, I want that. I need to eat. I've got to do that. It's not reasoning, hey, there's a rope around that food. It's not thinking that way. It's just going with instinct. And I see this every day in my house with my dog. I'm not going to show a picture of him. He's a bulldog, not your traditional kind of big bloated, short legs type of bulldog. He's an old English bulldog, which is the way bulldogs were originally meant to be bred, where they're still athletic and all this. But here's the thing about, we wanted a dog that was athletic and could move around and could run with us and stuff. But his instinct does not work very well when you also have 15 chickens. So what happens every day is our chickens kind of free roam in our backyard, and we just got some new ones, and some of them are very small and delicious looking, I'm sure, to punch. And every time he gets up and he's standing at the back door, at our sliding door, and you can just tell his eyes actually change color. Like his pupils totally take over the color in his eyes, and you know, well, something bad's going to happen. And sure enough, you open the door, he bolts out, and what's the first thing Punch does every day? He chases these chickens every time. It's just instinct. It's what he wants to do. And you can say, well, Paul, you should train him not to do that. Yes, I know. I know. It's hard, okay? Training animals is hard. But without training, an animal is just going to do what it's going to do because of instinct. I see that in my dog. I see that in other animals. And we see the same thing in false teachers. All false teachers care about is the same thing Punch cares about, self-preservation. That's it. And maybe that's because it's somewhat bred into us, whether it's through the public school system or whatever else, the idea of survival of the fittest. Whatever it is, you have to rise to the top. Hey, kids, by the way, when you grow up, you have to be the best person in your career. It's not just that you have to work hard. You have to dominate these other people. That's kind of a mentality that creeps into our education, into our youth, that you can't just do well. You have to be the best. And not just the best in regards to, I want to please the Lord with my best, but I've got to be better than everybody else. And that really keys in on our instinct of self-preservation. So for a false teacher, they just want what they want. They want what's best for them. Hey, that food looks delicious. I'm going to run after it. And you can't reason with them because all they care about is their own judgment. And honestly, that's where we all start. Naturally, we are in a place where all we care about is ourselves. Naturally, we are sinners. We are sinners whose eyes are closed. We're blind. We're actually, the Bible says that we're dead. We're spiritually dead. And because of that, we live in sin, and false teachers take that and they live in that sin. They don't realize what they're doing. And just like an irrational animal who's living by instinct, that animal is going to be caught and destroyed, like Peter says. It's just only a matter of time. If you're only living by what you want, by what you want to do, by your own self-preservation, you're not going to notice, you're not going to be as keen to notice that you are walking into your own destruction. And this happens all the time. And you see it happening with false teachers, where they think they become invincible, or they think that they can hide their sin, and so they keep walking in it, and they progress in it more and more and more, and then eventually they're destroyed by it. Now, Peter says something that we kind of have to wrestle with a little bit about these false teachers, that he says they are ignorant. They're blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant. So, if they're ignorant, how can we blame them if they don't know any better? I mean, if they're just doing by instinct, right? They're not culpable for any of this. They're ignorant. And that's not exactly what Peter means. It's not that type of ignorance. It's actually ignoring what they already know. They're ignorant of what they should be doing, in the sense they're ignoring what they should be doing. And yes, they also don't know, if they're spiritually blind and they're coming into the church and they're saying all these things and they're just after themselves, then they aren't going to know a lot of things. If you've ever watched debates on YouTube or anything like that, there are a lot of intelligent people out there who are atheists. There are a lot of intelligent people out there who are Muslims or Buddhists or agnostics, they're very intelligent people and far more intelligent than I am. Just obviously, you guys know me. There's people who are very, very bright, very, very smart. And you go and you take them to the Word of God and you share it with them and you say, well, this is what it says. Don't you see how you even use those words, right? Well, don't you see that this is what God has said? And they say, no, I don't see that. That's that ignorance. They may know a lot. There's a lot of people who will tell you a lot of things that the Bible says, and they have not read it. And even if they have, they can't understand it without the work of the Spirit. I shared that, I think, last week when I was talking about I went from not understanding the Bible to all of a sudden reading Matthew and saying, wow, what is this? What is this that I've been missing my whole life? And that's because these things are spiritually discerned. And so there's an ignorance that exists in these false teachers. They don't know what they're doing in one sense, but they also have heard what they shouldn't be doing and are just ignoring it. And so what happens as a result of this? So we already kind of talked about it, but Peter ends this by saying that they will also be destroyed. This is the end of verse 12. They will also be destroyed in their destruction. So in pursuing these things, they're not only destroying people around them, but they're going to destroy themselves. And this is a sad reality that we've seen with some high-level people, right, who have destroyed lives in the name of Christ, but have actually also destroyed their own lives in following after these things. And sadly, you don't have to look too far back to think of these people, and you can probably think of names right now. But they are destroyed by their own destructive behavior. In time, a false teacher will destroy themselves. They will destroy themselves. They will suffer wrong for their wrongdoing. You cannot live a life of wickedness and evil and sin without suffering the consequences of it. You just can't. So any of you in here who may be giving into habitual sin or think that you can just do whatever you want and honor God with your lips, but your heart's really far from Him, just know, and I can speak from experience here, and a lot of us can, just know that sin will kill you in the end. It will destroy you unless you have a Redeemer who's died for it, unless you've had someone who's paid the price for it, unless you've had someone that you see as so lovely that He is more wonderful than that sin. Otherwise, you're going to keep doing it. You have to replace the desire for sin that comes in your flesh with a desire for God. You can't just get rid of it by saying, I'm not going to sin anymore. You have to replace it with something. You have to replace that affection for your sin with an affection for something greater, which is Christ. There's no other way around it. You can lie like I used to lie. As a kid, I was a compulsive liar. And one time I told one of my dad's friends, after a choir concert, I was like in 4th or 5th grade, and I said to one of my dad's friends, hey, we're moving to California. We weren't moving to California. I don't even know where that came from. I just liked to lie. I just liked it. I enjoyed lying. I enjoyed telling stories. I actually think that Irish proverb, which is never let the truth get in the way of a good story, I think that was written for me as a child. A good story is far better than the truth. That's how I felt. And so my father's friend heard this and called my dad and was very upset with my dad. I thought we were friends, and you didn't tell me that you were leaving? You guys are moving? That affected my dad. Just one little lie. No big deal, right? And for a lot of my childhood, I lied and lied and lied. And to be honest, sometimes I'm so surprised that I care as much about the truth today as I do. I mean, genuinely, I think about that often. I think, man, God, how did this happen? How did a person go from somebody who only cared about lying so that I could, hide, or because I was afraid, or because I just liked it? How did I go from that to a person who every Sunday that I have an opportunity is saying, this is what's true, this is what's true, this is what's true, this is what's true? And it's only by the grace of God. I mean, I look at this, I say it's only by the grace of God. But brothers, sisters, friends, wherever you're at today, if you are in a situation where you're just looking at your sin and you kind of treat it in this nonchalant way, like, it's not that big a deal, well, just know one day it will destroy you. In some way, shape, or form, it will destroy you. Just like an animal. You'll walk right into the snare. You'll walk right in, you won't realize it, and then you'll be caught, and it's a tragedy. How many kids are in juvie, or how many adults are in jail because of one decision leading to another, leading to another, leading to another? How many broken marriages are there? How many kids are there that are in homes that, what a sad thing that when COVID happened, one of the worst things about the COVID was that kids were taken out of school. Not because obviously it wasn't because they were getting a good education in some regards, but the bad thing was that these kids were safer in school than they were at home. And so they're at home for a year or however long, and it is dangerous for them to be there. All because sin goes unchecked. All because God is not on the throne in so many people's lives. And those people come into the church, and rather than submitting to Christ, they seek to destroy what Christ has built. So they're arrogant, they're animalistic, and finally, they're hedonistic. And I use this word because it's the actual word in Greek for this. But Peter gives us the definition of it. He says, they count it pleasure, this is in verse 13, they count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. So a hedonist is somebody who is looking for their own pleasure. Now, if you read John Piper's Desiring God, you'll see that he puts a spin on this about Christian hedonism. I'm not going to go into that this morning, but it's probably the most influential book I've ever personally read. So take that for what it is. But in the general sense of the word, hedonist is somebody who is simply after their own pleasure. And these people, these false teachers, what they do is they take pleasure in their revelry. They take pleasure in the fact that they're sinning openly. And they're doing it with all of us. And we don't want to hurt their feelings, so we just say, okay, thanks, you're fine. I'm okay, you're okay. Let's just all get together and love each other, and it'll all work out in the end. All this stuff has crept into the church, and these false teachers come in and they take pleasure in it. And they're not even hiding in the nighttime. They get to the point where people are starting to listen to what they're saying, and they are actually doing these things, outright sin, right out in the open for people to see. Philippians 3:19, Paul was talking about people who have become enemies of Christ, these people who were in the church, but they had fallen in love with the world, and they become enemies of the gospel. And he says this, their end is destruction, their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame with minds set on earthly things. Their God is their belly. What matters most to me is, how can I be filled? How can I feel joy? What kind of pleasures can I receive? And they make it all about them. They even glory in their shame, Paul says. They don't call it shame. They glory in it. And this is totally making its way into the church right now. In a major way. With all the stuff that's going on, I don't mean to nitpick on this, and I know I talk about it a lot, but it's just because it's what our world is. But the homosexuality and gender issues and all these things are are at this fever pitch where the church is saying, okay, well, maybe we have to redefine some things. Maybe we've gotten it wrong for so many years, so we have to redefine some things. And then you move the goalpost a little bit further. You say, okay, well, we've moved it this far. We won't move it any further than that. But if you move it at all, if you take what God has said is this is what's good, this is what's not, and you start moving that goalpost, there's no end to how far you're going to move it. There's just no end. And we're seeing that creep into the church where things where it used to be, well, God said this, but now it's, and I know there's a lot of nuance, but just as its bare foundation, God says this in His Word about all kinds of sins, not just homosexuality. He says it about adultery. He says it about all sorts of things. And we like, in our human pride, we like to take that and we say, oh no, let me step around it this way so it's not as bad. It's not as bad. And we all do this. We all justify little sins, big sins. We all tend to take little things and we say, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe it's not so wrong. And this all comes back to what I say all the time. It's like a hammer, it's like a nail that I keep hitting over and over again. It's probably just to remind myself more than anybody else. But the lie has not changed from the beginning. Did God really say? That's all Satan had to say to Eve. Did God really say that you shouldn't do that? Oh, maybe not. And here we are. One sin, and we live in the fallenness and brokenness of this world every day because of one moment in time. And we look at all these things. We look at what's happening in the world. And brothers and sisters, you look at it, and everybody is just dying to please themselves. They're dying to get what they want. Would you please affirm me? Would you please make sure that I feel good about myself? Would you please do this for me, 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 me? So much of it comes back to that. There are people who are making good arguments and who are having dialogues that is very helpful to the conversation. But I just think that when you tear back the veil a little bit, at the bottom of a lot of what's going on in our world right now is, how can I find pleasure? Where can I find joy? How can I feel good about what I'm doing because I don't want to change? And we can fall into this as well. It creeps into the church. And we like to pretend it's not there, but Peter says that these people are like blots and blemishes. You know, you can put makeup on a pimple. It doesn't mean it goes away. You can do a lot of things to try to hide that. It's not gone. I had terrible acne when I was a teenager, to the point where I had to take medication for it to try to dry out my skin to make it go away. And I remember looking at myself, and I'm sure some of you teens feel this way. Some of you are starting to have acne and things like that. Your body's starting to change. Like, you become really you become self-absorbed for one, because you're just thinking about how bad you look all the time. And you become really self-aware because you're thinking, oh man. And what is that? It's because what used to be just this blank canvas for the most part now has all these blemishes and spots on it, and it's hard not to notice them. And it's hard not to be upset about it. Say, oh, why is this here? And you always get the big one right before you're supposed to go meet a bunch of people somewhere or something. But you can't hide it. And similarly, these false teachers who come in, they get to a point where they're not even going to try to hide it anymore. And they're ruining the purity of the church. They're ruining it. One blot, one blemish at a time, they ruin it. Because he says they revel in their deceptions. There are people who don't know that they're doing this, but there are a vast amount of people who come in, creep into the church, and for selfish reasons deceive other believers. And this is happening in the church, and it can happen in our church. Remember, Peter's not writing about something that could happen. He's writing about something that is happening. They're already in the church. False teachers are already in the church. And he says, and this is scary language when you think about it, he says, they're blots and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions while they feast with you. So, You're just sitting, having a meal. Maybe this is the Lord's Supper. Make no mistake, there's a reason why I say whenever we take the Lord's Supper together, if you're not a believer, don't take this because you don't believe it. It doesn't matter to you. I'm not picking on those people. I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad. But it's like, this is a very important thing that we do. We've got to take this seriously. And so whether it's the Lord's Supper or they're just sharing like a meal together, they're doing it, they're just sitting and they're enjoying fellowship, but they're secretly destroying the church while they're doing it. And I've seen this in person. Not currently, but I've seen it in the past. They feast with us. Jude said they feast without fear. They're not afraid of getting caught. He says their eyes are full of adultery. Now, Peter was probably thinking of men specifically here. And I'm sure that he heard of this or he saw this, but where you might have a man come into the church and he just starts eyeing every woman in the church and seeing her in a way where it's, again, self-gratification. Peter is really going into detail here, isn't he? He's not just saying, oh, false teachers are bad, watch out. He's saying this is how bad they are. This is their character. They are out to destroy the church. And they will if we don't pay attention. They have eyes full of adultery. They're insatiable for sin. They don't care about holiness. They just care about what they want. And so they come in, brothers and sisters, and they come and in the midst, and we're not really discerning, or maybe we haven't read this text, and so we're not really keeping an eye out for it or anything. And what does Peter say? He says they have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. So people who are unsteady in their faith, people who kind of are in a place where there's doubt or they're kind of wondering maybe this isn't true or not, those people key in, or the false teachers key in on those people, and just like a wolf coming after a weak sheep, they come in and they say, okay, well, have you ever thought of this? Well, maybe the reason that your suffering has lasted so long is maybe God doesn't love you. Maybe you don't. How about this one? You've heard this one before. Maybe the reason you're so sick is because you just don't have enough faith. You just don't have enough faith. Work harder. Well, yeah, that's one thing I guess I haven't tried. So they key in on people who are unsteady in their soul, in their being, and they entice them. Come with me. Paul talks about this in Romans 16, 17 through 18. He says, I appeal to you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and create obstacles contrary to the doctrine that you have been taught. Avoid them. For such persons do not serve our Lord Christ, but their own appetites, and by smooth talk and flattery, they deceive the hearts of the naive. It also reminds me of Proverbs 1, 10 through 19. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. Don't listen to them. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive, and whole like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all precious goods. We shall fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot among us. We will all have one purse, right? This is come and do bad stuff. Come on, this will be great. We're gonna mess with people. We might get some money out of it. Come on, this is gonna be so awesome. Join us. And the dad says, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths, for their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood, for in vain. He's trying to show their folly. In vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird. Right? If you put a net out in front of a bird and you think, I'm going to catch it, and it's watching everything you're doing at that moment, it's probably not going to go into it. But he says, but these men, they lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. Such are the ways of everyone who is greedy for unjust gain. It takes away the life of its possessors. So these people are saying, I want what I want to get what I want, it's all about me, me, me. Hey, this isn't fun anymore by myself. Come along, join me. And they destroy themselves and they take you along with them. He also says they have hearts trained in greed. It's not just that they're greedy, but their hearts are trained in it. Now, how does your heart get trained in greed? Well, how do you get trained in anything? By doing it over and over and over again. They've worked the same muscle over and over again. How do you work the muscle of greed? Well, you're tempted, I want something, and you work out that muscle by giving into that temptation. So I've given into greed over and over and over and over again. Give me what I want. I want this, I want this, I want this. And their hearts are trained for it. So brothers and sisters, all this points to the fact that they will destroy the church from the inside if we are not careful. And that's why Jesus himself even said in Matthew 7:15, he said, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. They look like a sheep. They look like a sheep. They walk like you. They talk like you. They look like that. But inside, they're wolves seeking to pleasure themselves and to seek their own good. And you think, oh, Peter, haven't you said enough? And then he ends it by calling them accursed children, saying these people are cursed. In God's eyes, they are cursed. And then he gives this example in verse 15, forsaking the right way. Instead of going the right way, they've forsaken that. They have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing, but was rebuked for his own transgression. A speechless donkey spoke with human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. So just real quick recap on this. We talked about him when we went through Jude, but really quick recap is Balak, the king of Moab, needed some help. He asked Balaam, who is this quote-unquote prophet, to come and say these prophecies against Israel. First, Balaam really wasn't going to do it, but Balaam wanted money. He liked money. And so eventually he agrees to go and say these things. God doesn't want him to do it, so on the way, Balaam's riding a donkey. And the donkey sees the angel of the Lord, basically barring the way, like, Balaam, don't go this way. So the donkey sees it and tries to move a different direction. Balaam gets mad at the donkey. The donkey still sees it. He gets mad again. He's kicking the donkey to the point where God opens up the mouth of the donkey and the donkey begins to speak to Balaam, which, again, last time we talked about this, is like, how weird would that have been in that moment? But God did not want him to go. But Balaam, because he was greedy for unjust gain, was going to go anyway. And actually, James Everett pointed this out to me after we went through that section in Jude, and it was really helpful. So, brother, thanks for this thought. But think of this. You have Balaam, who's a human being, who is supposed to be this prophet for God, and he doesn't see the angel of the Lord, but a donkey does. An animal, a creature, has more sense than a person who is greedy for unjust gain. It's really incredible when you think about that. And so these false teachers have done the same thing. Oh yeah, I'll come in and I'll lift my hands to God and I'll say all these great things about God and I'll pray certain prayers. I'll fall into the cult of personality of Christianity. I can do that. Yeah, if it means that I'll get friends and I'll have this therapy, that people can meet my therapeutic need, and it's all coming back to me. What can the church do for me? It's very subtle. It's very subtle. So real quick, just to end this, okay, 3 takeaways that I want to give you from this passage, and they might be different than what you'd think. The first takeaway that I think we need to have is this, that Christ loves his church. Christ loves his church. When Jesus looks at his church as part of his body, he sees this church, our church and the church global, as precious to him. It is precious to Jesus. He died for the church. He was raised so that the church could be with God again. The church is very precious to him. And I grow increasingly concerned with my own heart and with the heart that I see kind of growing in the church, where the church has become unimportant. The church has been something that you can take or leave. Or people start shooting their own. The church starts like shooting their own and treating one another not as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, but when can I just get this person out of my life, or all those types of attitudes. And the church is just far too precious to Christ for us to treat it in the ways that many people do. The second takeaway is this, that because Christ loves his church, the church should love the church. We should love the church. Now, when I say that, I don't mean some formal organization. Like, okay, this is Paul's way of telling me that I need to love some of you. Well, okay. We are a local gathering of a global church. And I said this, I think Cale Rogers and I were talking when we were up at DTC. And we were talking about, branding and how churches, brand themselves and they get all this cool stuff and they try to market themselves and all these things. I just want you to know, I could care less if anybody knows the name of Summit View or thinks that we have a great building. I could care less if Summit View lasts. What I care is if you last. I don't care about some formal organization. I care about you because Christ doesn't care about some formal organization. He cares about what the church actually is, and that's his people. So when I say church, love the church, I mean love each other. Love the people whom Christ died for. This is a non-negotiable. You cannot be a Christian and say, I don't need the church, or I don't love the church, or the church is optional. It's just outside of God's mentality for the church. And finally, the third takeaway is that this church, our church, the global church, it is worth protecting. If Jesus died for it, and we get to be a part of it by his grace, it is worth protecting. And the way we protect it is false teaching must be recognized, and false teachers must be called out and corrected. I mean, look at what Peter said about false teachers. He said they were bold, willful, blasphemous, irrational, instinctual, born for destruction, ignorant, revelers, blots, blemishes, deceptive, adulterers, insatiable, enticers, greedy, accursed, forsaken, and gone astray. I lost count. I think 18 things that he used to describe false teachers. Now, I'm not saying that we should be jerks and treat everybody terribly, and all of a sudden this gives us the excuse to be mean to everybody and say, oh yeah, look at what you're doing wrong, look at what you're doing wrong, look at what you're doing wrong. We still need to be humble and loving and respectful in the best ways that we can. These are people made in the image of God. But just as Paul says in Ephesians 5:11, take no part in unfruitful works of darkness, no part, but instead expose them. Because when things get brought to the light, people either run back into the dark to hide there, or they receive the light, and they see it in their own lives, and they turn from it. So this is so important, because we are in a time right now where people don't want to talk about sin, they don't want to say the word, they don't want to make anybody feel bad. And I just want to say this. If nobody feels bad about their sin, then the gospel is meaningless. If sin doesn't matter, and we're just trying to make each other feel better, like, hey, yeah, come to church, we'll love you, we're not going to really hold you to account for anything, because, we just don't worry about that here. We just want to be friends. It just doesn't work that way. It removes what Christ did on the cross for us. I mean, why did he come to die? I mean, are we sinners or not? Are we people who sin or not? And if we act like we aren't, and we treat one another like we don't need to talk about these things, then false teachers will come in and they'll start pulling people away, and we won't know how to have a conversation about sin, so we'll just let it happen, and the church will be shipwrecked. I don't want to see that happen. Do you? I really don't. So whether you're in some of you or whether you move and go to some other church, wherever you end up in this life, kids, adults, wherever you end up, my hope is that you don't end up wherever you are because someone led you away from Christ. My hope is that you are wherever you are because God has called you to be there and you are following him wherever he leads. But we have to be able to have straight talk without being cruel, without being mean, while at the same time calling things as they are. So, boy, these are heavy, aren't they? You know, it's one of those times where as a pastor, you look at the next passage and you say, again? More weight. God, more weight. And again, I don't think that's bad. It's just something we need to be aware of. Stuff we need to know. So let's pray. I'm going to pray and then you guys can pray together. Lord God, I thank you that Peter was straight with us. I thank you that he's straight with the church. And whatever I said today that's unhelpful, Lord, just remove it from people's minds, memories, ears. What's most important, Lord, is that you have spoken to us about the dangers that lurk in our midst. And God, what I don't want to happen, I know you don't want to happen, is that we start treating each other terribly, or we start looking for flaws in each other, ways to correct, ways to change people. Like, it's not about us, God. So just help us all together as a community to, in humility, walk with one another, in accountability for sin, to walk with one another, in bringing each other to grace. Even false teachers, if there's anyone in our church that is secretly doing this or that we don't know about, I pray for those people right now, Lord, or in other churches in the city or just in our nation, wherever these people are. I pray for them, Lord, that you would remove that deceit from them, that you would remove their hearts of pride and arrogance, and you would draw them to yourself so that they, like Paul, who was an arrogant Pharisee, that they would become humble and small and seek to glorify you in their lives. Lord, that is what you do. I pray that you would do that here. Make us a church that glorifies you, magnifies you, and loves you so that sin does not entice us. I pray that in Jesus' name.